Hey there. Well, tonight's a different kind of night here on Storytelling Live. Yep. This one goes out to Quinn, my son. So Quinny, he decided that he wanted to go through Mom's stuff during the pandemic. He wanted to get a little nostalgic. He wanted to learn about where he came from, his parents, what we all did when, before kids existed in our lives. So Quinn decided he wanted to hear about stuff that I had done before he was born. Howdy, Peggy. So I had said something about, masks, and he said, yeah, it's too bad we don't have a gas mask. And his brothers looked at him and went, I think Mom has one of those. Think you'll find that we do. And he was like, you gotta be kidding me. So he came up to my room one night, and here we were, all night long. It was like 2, 3 in the morning. And I was like, yeah, Mom's got a gas mask. You can't show someone that you got a gas mask and then not tell them how you got the gas mask, right? So, yeah. So this is not an American one. This is Israeli issue. I took mine home with me. Come get it, Israel. No, I shouldn't say that. They will if you've ever met them. Al, you can't have it. I was working for a little news magazine on Long Beach Island called The Sandpaper. And it's owned by the Travers family, Kurt and Gail Travers. Hey, Kurt. Hey, Gail. My editor at the time was a lovely lady, Dame Maria Scandell. And so we had this photographer, and his name was Jeff Bustrin. Jeff was an interesting character. Ginger, big mustache, big guy, like 6'4", built, big, heavy-set guy. And he had gone out to the Air Force Base. We were in New Jersey on Long Beach Island. He went out, and he came back all excited. He said, they said that if we could get anyone who can get a visa into Saudi Arabia, they'll put on a plane and take them there. And everybody just went, yeah, well, that's great. So, anyone who can, get the witch's broomstick is getting the heck out of Oz, but that's not happening. And I said, why not? I mean, how hard can that be? Because I had done my internship in college at the United Nations. And I said, I'm going to call somebody and find out, what it would take. So we went through the whole process, filled out all the paperwork, sent it all in, and we waited. We waited and we waited, and people started laughing at us and saying, I told you so, and you're from a little tiny newspaper in New Jersey, no one's going to give you a visa anyway. And then my friend at the UN enlightened me and said, you are a woman. I said, yes, last time I checked. He said, well, there's just a thing about Saudi men and Saudi officials that if you just showed up at the embassy in DC and told them you'd been called to come get your visa and that it was ready and that you'd come all that way, they'd probably give you your visa. And so we took the chance and we hopped in the car and we drove to DC from Long Beach Island, New Jersey. And I had my hair covered, wore a scarf, and got there and very respectfully said, yes, well, you've had our paperwork for, weeks now, and we just got a call to come down and pick it up. And they said, did you? I said, yes, we absolutely did. We're here to pick it up. And people went into back rooms, and they came back out, and they looked, and they pointed, and they whispered, and they went back into the back rooms, and time passed, and seasons changed, and grass grew, and they came out with our visas and sent us on our merry way. And then, a la Wizard of Oz, we went back to the Air Force Base and said, here's our visas. It's time to take us to Saudi Arabia. And they couldn't really argue that because they were on the record saying it. Their press guy really wished he hadn't said it on the record at that point in time. So we were the only ones to go in. And we went to Dhahran in Saudi Arabia. And we flew in. Very long flight. I will tell you that on a C-130 and a C-141, man, it's cold. It's freezing, freezing cold on those planes. I know all my military friends have been on them, but you will understand. This is like, stop complaining about coach, because there's no insulation. It's freezing. It's loud, and it's like 2 days on a plane. So we got there. We stayed in Saudi Arabia, and we covered there. Saudi Arabia went fine. I was not accustomed or acquainted with in any way, shape, or form Muslim culture at that point in time. So that was a huge shock as a woman, to not be allowed to, buy things on my own at that time, or to function in society. We came back after that. We spent a week there, came back, and the gas mask didn't come up until we wanted to, press our luck and go to Israel and cover the rest of the war. I want to spend the rest of the war in Israel. And so we got our visas and we got set up to go. And I was a young, newly married person. We didn't have kids yet. This was right after we got married, that here I am going to Israel for the Gulf War. And my husband at the time worked for the Asbury Park Press in New Jersey as a reporter, and he's got all my information, and he knows what hotel I'm staying in and everything. We get to Israel after many, many, many hours of the Mossad questioning us before we could ever get on a plane, because El Al was not letting anybody on that plane until they had vetted the life out of them. And I had bought a gas mask at an Army-Navy store, and as soon as I got on the plane, one of the guys said, "Matt's not going to do the job," and they handed out Israeli issue gas masks. And what else do we have? Oh yeah, so atropine. Remember last night's story? If you don't, you're going to have to go watch it, about the plant in Virginia that was used by the Jamestown settlers to best the British. And one of the drugs that Jimson weed produces is atropine. So that's what's in this baby here. It's pretty old, but I bet you still don't want to stick yourself with this unless you're actually having a nerve gas attack, because it will mess with your heart. And then this is the powder that they issued all of us in the event of a mustard gas attack. This is a fun plane ride to Israel. So we hit the ground in Israel, and we're being taught how to put these together, and what the air raid sirens mean, and how we're supposed to go down into the shelters, and what we have to do. And we speak absolutely none of the language, so we're badly prepared for this trip. And we get there, and they're about to take us to our hotel, and the bus we're all on stops, and there's somebody comes up in black cars, and they stop us, and there's a lot of talking, and they come back and they say, "We're sorry, but we're bypassing the hotel." I was like, "Why are we bypassing the hotel?" And they said, "There's a problem with the hotel. There's a problem. We've heard that there's a problem with the hotel." And I was like, what would that problem be? And they said, "It's not there anymore." It's like, And he said, "Yeah, there was an attack. There was a Scud missile, and it literally came down the center of the street, flew down the middle of the block, and took the edifices off of every building on either side. There was just nothing. They all looked like the back sides of doll houses. There's nothing there. Just a big pile of rubble in the middle. And at the end of all the blocks, there was a crater that the missile was in, and it didn't explode. It just devastated all the blocks, and it didn't explode." And then I had to try and contact my husband through the geniuses at the Asbury Park Press to explain to them that I wasn't going to be in that hotel because it had been blown up. And I did not want him to get that AP Wire story and think that his wife had been blown up. Unfortunately, it was possibly the only editor at the Asbury Park Press that I didn't know at the time. And he was, I don't know how he rose to editor. He had to have been related to somebody somehow, because he got the message altogether wrong and then proceeded to not tell him. So I check into the new hotel across from the Tel Aviv Hilton downtown in Tel Aviv, in this little hotel across the street, because I couldn't afford to be in the Hilton as a mercenary and a mercenary journalist. And hours go by, and the next day, and I get this hysterical phone call from my husband, who's finally found a way to reach me because there were no cell phones. And he had to track me down through God knows who to find out that I wasn't dead. So that was like the start. And Quinn was particularly clear on the point that he wants me to tell you 2 stories of what happened here. So we did what we were supposed to do initially, like you do. Air raid sirens went off, gas masks went on, and we would go down to the shelters and stay there through the duration. But that got old really fast because we weren't getting any stories except the story of what it's like to be inside a shelter. And of course we wanted to have that experience, but as journalists, we're crazy. And as I mentioned in a previous evening's readings, journalists go towards the danger, not away from it. If something's blowing up, we want to be there, right? And I think I talked about the CNN cameraman during that time. But we wanted to be where the action was, so we would go into the Tel Aviv Hilton, and the sirens would go off, and we would go all the way to the top before, everything hit, and we'd go up to the roof, and the roof had a secondary ladder that you could climb down hand over hand outside. I don't know how many stories the Tel Aviv Hilton is. I don't remember. I think it's 15 stories or something. So we would go over the edge of the building and climb down, and we would sit behind this little bulwark of, concrete, so that we could see where the missiles were going to land, because Bibi Netanyahu and the whole deal there didn't want us to know, because journalists are idiots. And the first thing that CNN learned when they got there, and the New York Times and everybody else, long before we got there, was that Saddam Hussein didn't know how to guide the Scud missiles. They had a crappy guidance system, and he didn't know what he was hitting, and it was exactly like a game of Battleship. Until somebody reported what was damaged, he couldn't calibrate, the next missile. So we couldn't report on it and say where it hit, but we would want to go to where the damage was so we could at least take pictures and talk to people. And the only way to really get that job done was to either buy a police radio from one of the police, they would sell them on the black market, and you could buy a police radio, and then you'd have to have a taxi driver on standby and pay them $25 an hour to take you to wherever the site was and stay with you and get you back in one piece. And they had fixers in Israel who would do that, but we were impoverished and working for the sandpaper. People are going up and they're like, who are you working for? And people are like, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Globe and Mail, Miami Herald. The sandpaper did not carry a lot of weight. So we would go up there so that we could see the missiles coming in and figure out where they were going to hit. Unfortunately, one night we were sitting there and the missile came straight at the Hilton, just like we were just saying goodbye to each other. I was there with an Israeli journalist, and he and I were, just looking at each other like, well, this is it, because it was coming right at us, and it just did the straight over us and right into the sea. Poof. Shook up the place, a lot of debris, but the Hilton sustained no damage, and we just needed a change of clothing before we had to go and chase in a taxi and see where it landed. So that was how we did it. That was how we did it. And then the war stalled, right? They had peace talks. And we decided that we were going to go to Jerusalem. and we got to Jerusalem, my photographer and I. And before we left, my husband had told me something that was very smart. He said, photographers are insane. News photographers are insane human beings, okay? Their whole world is here, okay? Nothing here exists, and it's true. It's true. News photographers have a phenomenally high death rate. Phenomenally high. They are all Mr. Magoo. I love you guys, but you know you are. Steve Falk knows it because he knows Jeff. And Steve Falk, phenomenal photographer with the Philadelphia Daily News and does incredible coverage, was with us. And he in Saudi Arabia, and he knows that it's bats. So my husband had said to me, if Jeff starts to lead you off into the desert blindly chasing something and your camel is tied to his camel, you're going to need to cut the rope between your camel and his, because I don't want you to die out there, babe. I was like, okay. So there we were in Jerusalem in the old city, and we were walking through the souks in the old city, and the streets are about this wide, and there are all of these tin roofs that have been placed by people, and if you can't guess why, I will tell you. It's because children, Palestinian children, will climb up to the roofs and they will pelt you with rocks and try and just brain you as you're walking down the streets. That's how it was at that time. And it happened to us while we were there. We had to dodge and hide and like get up against the buildings. I was like, okay, the tin roofs it is. But Jeff didn't have the sense that God gave a goose, and we were out by the Green Line, and all of the Palestinians who lived on the other side had to be back across the Green Line by sunset, and it was a law. And so there was a whole bunch of Palestinians waiting. They're coming off of buses. The place was just filling up wall to wall. And Jeff saw this old man with a goat and, oh no, it was a donkey, old man with a donkey. And he wanted to get a shot. And the old man clearly did not want to have anything to do with a Westerner. He did not want his picture taken. No, he did not. And Jeff was not situationally aware of this, and he's like, meanwhile, we're being steadily surrounded by very angry people with rocks. And I knew this was the cut the camel rope moment, but I also couldn't leave Jeff there to die. And here's why. It's not just because Jeff was a good person and I liked him. It was because Jeff had a special ability. He had, and I don't know if he still has, but he had a superpower. We literally were lost in the desert at one point when we were in Saudi Arabia. We had gotten separated from our party. We could not find our way back to the flight line, and we were really getting scared, and it was hot, and we were out of water, and we thought we were in trouble. And Jeff said, hang on. And we were like, what is it? And my friend Mark Belagamba said, donuts, it's the donut ability. I was like, what the hell is the donut ability? He said, trust me when I tell you that if there's a donut shop anywhere, he can tell you. He can point us towards it. It's a thing. And I was like, come on, it's not even funny anymore. And Jeff kind of, like a divining rod, turned, and he turned, and he turned. And he's like, this way. And I was like, this is ridiculous. I'm following a donut? He said, no, Jeff's following the donut. We're following Jeff. So we did that in the desert. And Jeff found donuts in a mess hall somewhere, somehow, in a tent by the flight line. He remembered they were there, and he just, see the donut, be the donut, and he got us there. So because of that, I knew that, we were in the middle of a war, and God alone knows when you might need the donut power again. So I had to get Jeff out of there. So I went in and extricated him and smiled and made things like he's a crazy person and he's not well, and I'm taking the camera away. Yes, I am. And just like, what's my camera? Like, yeah, you can have it back later. Took the camera, stuck it in my backpack. I was like, okay, we're leaving, and we got out of there. And on our way out, we passed a little boy by a tree, and Jeff, of course, had more than one camera, so he snapped a picture of the little boy. And the little boy came running over to me and goes, lady, take my picture, take a picture with me, lady. And he says, my mother has no pictures of me. She has no pictures of me. Take a picture of me, bring it back to me tomorrow. And of course, I'm a dummy. So I said, sure. This is like a 12-year-old kid. So we took the photo under the big tree, and it's on my wall somewhere downstairs, I think. And we went back, and he said, here, tomorrow, 2 o'clock, you come back. So we said, okay, and Jeff shot a bunch of photos. We got back, and Jeff went to get them developed. And I was sitting there in the Tel Aviv Hilton, having some really strong coffee and talking to other reporters. And I was telling them the story, and a guy came up to me, like, who materialized out of nowhere, and he was with the Mossad. And he said, tell me the whole story. I'm like, what? He says, do you have the pictures of the child? I said, well, I'm a photographer. So he calls somebody over, sends him over to grab my photographer and the photos and the negatives, comes back and says, here's what we're going to do. Tomorrow, we'll be back. We're going to go with you. But don't worry, they're just trying to kidnap you because you're a journalist from America, and this is how they've been doing it. We've lost a couple so far, but this is good. I'm like, so I'm bait? He said, yeah. I'm like, cool, this is gonna be great. I can't wait. So that's what we did. We went back the next day, and I had the photos in an envelope, and I went by myself to the tree, and they had, like, I don't know, it looked like there was no Mossad there. It looked like I was on my own, to me. I got under the tree, and the kid wasn't there, and all of a sudden, a white, dirty, beat-up van that looks like every kidnapper van from every movie ever comes screeching up, doors open, guys jump out, and before they can get anywhere near me, like, Mossad just materialized. They did. They just, I don't know even where they came from. I feel like they must have been underground in the trees, everywhere. They were everywhere. And they wound up taking down like 5 or 6 guys, and never saw the kid again. He wasn't there. But they said, yeah, this is at least they won't get the next few journalists. I'm like, awesome. So we wrote about that. And then that was just not the last of our worries, because we got back, and a few days later, this German guy came up to me in a cafe and bought me a cup of coffee and said, yeah, you're a journalist. I said, yeah. He says, well, would you bring something for me in your package that you're going to be taking home? And I'm like, anyone who sounds like a Nazi is not a good guy. I know, I'm sorry, it's a prejudice thing. But he says, because everything goes through the censor, which was true. This is kind of fun. Here's our Tel Aviv Hilton. So in order to fax my stories back, I had to give them all to the censor, who would block stuff out and then stamp it. And if it was stamped by the censor, then you were allowed to transmit. You couldn't have a computer, you could not have a dedicated line, could not send anything. You had to fax it, and it had to go through the censor first. And when you were going to leave Israel during the war, when you got there, they gave you government-issued notebooks. And these notebooks had the censor's seal on them. And when you were done, they would go through your whole notebook and they would black things out. And then they would put them into envelopes and they would close them and they would seal them with the seal of the censor. And if that seal was broken when you were getting onto the plane or getting off of the plane, then all your notebooks and everything would be confiscated. So I was about to leave the country at that point after a month in Israel and 9 Scud missile attacks. And this guy was asking if he could hide stuff in the package, and I don't know, I was in full-blown Matahari mode after our successfully, taken down the kidnapper ring. So I thought I was like, yeah, no problem. When do you want to meet? And he's like, we'll come here. We'll have another discussion. I'm like, yeah, tell me when, tell me where. And I went back and before I could say anything, I got back to the hotel and this same Mossad guy was sitting there and he's like sipping his coffee and he's like, so you have a meeting, I hear? And I'm like, wow, you guys are good. He's like, we've been following you. I'm like, oh my God, really? Hey, Janine. I was just talking about Steve. So I agreed and they set up everything and I said, but my photographer has to be able to shoot this. We have to have photos of this meeting. So we met, it was in a street cafe and we did the whole thing. The guy handed off the documents to me that he wanted me to put in. And as soon as he handed them off to me, they told me I could leave, just take it and go. And so, because I took it and I got back to the hotel. And by the time I got back to the hotel, the guy was already like in captivity. And we had all of the photos. And I wound up selling that story to Soldier of Fortune. And it was spy versus spy in Tel Aviv. And I was the first woman to ever write for Soldier of Fortune. And I still have, I cashed the check, but I still have picked a Xerox of it because I was so proud of being the first woman to write for Soldier of Fortune magazine. I think I've told this story once before. But it's worth telling again for anyone who missed it. When I was first in Israel for the war, and we would have to go up to all of these press briefings, every single day. How right now Trump and everybody does their press briefings at a certain time of day? Well, Netanyahu would do his press briefing every day at a certain time. And I'm an early bird, so I would, get up early and I would stake out my spot and I would be ready to go. And this French cameraman for CNN, for Christian Amanpour, would always wake up late. And he would wake up he'd have a Gaulois cigarette hanging from his mouth and he would be, unkempt and smelly and knocking us down. And I was always in a prime spot and he was bigger than I was and he would literally hit me with his camera, knock me down, shove me out of the way. And when I tried to fight him for my spot, he'd say, I need to be where you are. I'm CNN. Who are you? You are nobody. I'm CNN. I must be here. I need to be where you are. So that happened a couple times, and so I finally learned about the camera that he was carrying. I took a good look at it because it was always in front of me, between me and the press meeting, the presser that was happening. I couldn't see anything, and so I realized that I could just detach the sound cable by just bumping him, jostling him, and just detach it, and I'd stick it in his photographers had these vests that have these mesh pockets across the back, and I could just slip it in there so it wouldn't be dangling. And he recorded the entire presser. And when it was time to go, I bumped him again and I put the sound cable back into the camera so that he wouldn't know what was going on. So we all got back to the Tel Aviv Hilton and he yells, Mr. Gawa smoking, Frenchman for CNN, and he is yelling and screaming and losing his mind. He does not understand. How could there be no sound? I recorded it. I never make mistakes. And Christian Amanpour was being very kind, but saying, well, I'm afraid it looks like you did. So I don't know how, but we can't, we're going to have to do a voiceover or something. And he was livid. And he didn't understand what was happening. So he kept knocking me down and taking my spot. And every time he did, he'd have no sound. And finally, one of the other reporters said, there does seem to be a correlation between, like, every time you knock down that reporter from America, you lose your sound. And he whirled around on me in front of all the other journalists. He's like, you did this to me? I said, yeah. So the next time you need to be where I am, just know that wherever I am isn't going to have a whole lot of talking going on. And he was like, you can't do this. I said, I think that you'll find that I can do that. And he's like, I will report you. I said, go. I'm with the sandpaper. I'll give you Kurt Travers' number. You can ring him up and tell him that nasty little woman that you keep knocking down to take her spot pulled your sound cable. And when he's done laughing, I will do it again. So he stopped because he was too riddled with anxiety. And then he started knocking down other journalists. So we all got together one night because he had this passion for sleeping on the roof deck of the Tel Aviv Hilton so that he could be the first one. He wanted to, with his special ears, hear the air raid sirens going from far and near, and he would be able to get that aerial shot from the top of the Tel Aviv Hilton. So he had a tent. But word got out that he also slept in the nude. And so one of the other camera guys had recorded the sound of the siren, and we all were up on the Tel Aviv Hilton roof, and they broadcast it really loud over the loudspeaker, like right in front of him. They had like a little speaker, not a loudspeaker, a speaker, and they broadcast it, and then they filmed him leaping out of the tent, like naked as the day he was born, with his camera on his shoulder, and like trying to capture this. And so he had to stop doing that. He stopped doing that after that. So that's kind of how covering a Gulf War from Saudi Arabia when you are a freelance journalist went for me. I'm going to read you one story from that time period. I hope I got this right. Let's find it. Okay. So, Tel Aviv. While Long Beach Island has had to contend with medical waste and tar balls washing up on its beaches, the seaside resort of Tel Aviv has both tar and Scud missiles cramping its tourist trade. The city here is reminiscent of Atlantic City, with its high-rise hotels and long stretches of open beach. Windsurfing rental shops and souvenir stands line the stone walkway that hugs the shoreline, but the 80-degree weather and sparkling aquamarine waters are not enough to entice visitors to Saddam Hussein's favorite target. This is an economic tragedy for us, one shop owner explained. It is technically the off-season, but this is more desolate than I have ever seen it. An IDF, Israeli Defense Force spokesman, commented during a drive across the city, I never thought I would live to see the day when Jerusalem had more nightlife than Tel Aviv. That's like saying that Barnegat is busier than Beach Haven in August. The city has become schizophrenic, the spokesman added. During the day, the streets are filled with people going on as if nothing in the world were different, and as soon as the sun begins to set, it's like a ghost town. People live like there is no tomorrow and buy like there will be no tomorrow, said Shimon Frankel, of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. People are not buying because tomorrow they could be hit by a missile. Many shops and rental agencies have taken advantage of the journalistic population to triple their off-season rates to try and make up for the lack of tourist trade. The cost of a room at the Hilton rose from $90 a day 2 days before the war to $150 a night since January, according to the Miami Herald photographer who has been in Israel since January 1st. The most reasonable prices to be found in the city are at shops and restaurants near the youth hostels and hotels that have taken in the refugees from the Scud-stricken areas outside the city. The Israelis here complained bitterly of the American government's decision to prolong the war instead of just going in and ridding the area of Hussein once and for all. A sight that has been virtually non-existent in Israel is becoming more common. Tent cities of homeless people have sprung up, and special underground shelters for the homeless have been devised for during missile attacks. An end to the war would not necessarily solve the city's financial problems, since its immediate result would mean that the journalists who have already begun an exodus to Jerusalem to cover the developments in the West Bank would empty the area of its only, quote, tourist income. The Hilton Hotel has nearly emptied since most journalists here are leaving Tel Aviv for more exciting places like Jordan and Gaza and Syria. Jeff and I are here batting cleanup. Nobody knows what the result of the negotiations will be, and even if there is an end to the war between the U.S. and Iraq, people here believe that as long as Hussein is still alive, there is a threat of Scuds and further aggression towards Israel. The feeling of gas masks being sealed onto our faces is still with us, and the looks of terror on the faces of the refugee children in our new hotel is etched in our memories. I can't help but think that these children are forever scarred by this feeling that you must be indoors by dark. That a small cardboard box slung over your shoulder is more important than money or food for sustaining life because it contains your gas mask, antidote needles, and anti-mustard gas powder for burns. People shouldn't have to live this way. I will tell you one last very funny incident because as I mentioned there, during the ceasefire, journalists had gone to other places to cover things, but Jeff and I couldn't go because the last stamp on our passport was Saudi Arabia, and we couldn't get access to some of the places we wanted to go to because we'd been in Saudi. But the Minister of Tourism was hanging around the Tel Aviv Hilton, and he said that we could go out and we could cover the J-24 class Olympic sailboat trials for the Israeli Olympic team. Well, I got Sail Magazine to buy that story in advance, and Jeff and I went out. There is nothing quite like a day out on the sea, off the shore of Tel Aviv, where the sea is just rolling up and down, and you're on a stable platform, literally a platform that has been anchored out. They only had 2 boats. 2. So in order to pick the Israeli sailing team that year, they had many pairs of sailors who were competing for the honor of competing. But they didn't have any compunction about sabotaging the boats once they got off them. So one team would get on and they'd find out once they're in the middle of a race that they didn't have any protest flags. Another team would get on a boat, they'd be in the middle of going around a mark, and they'd find out that the spinnaker had been tied in knots so that they couldn't hoist the spinnaker and they couldn't make the mark. They couldn't pick up speed. Meanwhile, the American soldiers who manned the Patriot bases were tremendous heroes, and the Ministry of Tourism wanted to thank them. So they had brought a crew from the Patriot base that had been protecting Tel Aviv throughout the war, out on the boat. The only problem was that one of those soldiers had never, ever been out on a boat before, and he had a raging case of seasickness. I have always said that you cannot convince a person who has seasickness that death is not imminent. And such was the case of this poor young man in his 20s. He was begging to get off of that raft. But the tourism minister wouldn't let him go because he was like, no, you're going to love this. Watch what happens next. He's like, buddy, I got to get off this raft and I don't feel well. And he's like, no, it's going to be great. You're going to love it. And he kept him there. Now, almost half of the Israeli sailors competing for the team lived on the kibbutz. These guys, I'm sorry, I don't know if you've ever met someone from Israel, but these guys from the kibbutz were like cast iron stomachs. They're indestructible human beings, okay? Indestructible. So they're out there on this raft, and it's lunchtime, and they pull out tins of sardines and raw onions, and they're eating these raw onions like they're apples and popping sardines like they're candy. And this poor soldier, he was like, I have to get off. So finally we convinced them to take him off the darn platform and bring him back in. And as we're heading back into shore, and he's like, oh God, oh thank God, we're moving. Because if you're moving, it's better. It's not great, but if you're moving at speed, it's better. And so, he started to look a little bit less like this color and a little bit more like this. And so the Israeli guy who was from the Ministry of Tourism said, oh, you're feeling better. Okay, and he instructs the driver to take the long route so that he can really show him the coastline. And at that point, the soldier just snapped his carrot. He pulled his weapon and just said, if you don't take me to shore right now, I'm going to waste you. And we're like, oh my God. And as I mentioned, if you have not met someone who is born and raised in Israel, particularly someone in the middle of the war, you will not understand what happened next. They laughed and they said, all right, so I guess you're serious about this thing. All right, put it away. And he was shaking. And I just walked up to him and I was like, I'm going to put my hands on your shoulders now, because this is not a thing that you want to do, because it's a bumpy ride. And if you shoot wrong, you could put a hole in the boat, and then we're going to be out here sinking, and it's going to take longer. And he's like, it could take longer. I'm like, it could take longer. And he's like, okay. And he holstered it, and he sat down, and we got back in. And they were trying very hard to convince him to have the other guys from the base come out the next day, and that did not happen. I don't think. I don't know who the Israeli sailing team was that year, but I know that they were a bunch of cheaters. But I wouldn't want to mess with any of them. So this was thanks to Quinn tonight. If you enjoyed it, thank him, because he was very proud that his mom had experienced those things. And so if we were in school, he said, this would be the ultimate show and tell. And he said that if Norfolk Public Schools were to reopen before this is all over, he's taking this. He's going to be wearing this. So let it be known to all of you that my kid's going to be the one sporting this, rocking this look. Thank you all for being here tonight. And tomorrow night we will be back to normal. No, there's no normal. Tomorrow night we'll be reading instead of just telling. But I am taking requests. So if you know of a column that I've done or something that you want me to read, just send me a message and I will make it happen. Hey, Ray. Good night.